I found the key to my stepdaughter's undoing inside a hollowed-out book of poetry she had tossed into a cardboard donation box 2 days after my husband's funeral. By the time the first garnishment check landed in my mailbox, with the words, "Family Betrayal Fee," printed in the memo line, she was already serving a federal sentence, and her husband's leased BMW was getting repoed in a Walgreens parking lot while a small crowd filmed it for TikTok. The check sat in my hand, a pale green rectangle with perforated edges, and I stood at the end of my driveway for a full 4 minutes just staring at the corrugated metal door of the box, letting the late autumn wind cut through my cardigan. That check was not just money. It was a receipt for the exact cost of pretending family loyalty is unconditional. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story, my story, is about how a $68,000 fertility contract, a hollow Dickinson anthology, and 20 years of locksmithing muscle memory turned a fraudulent hospital executive into an unwilling donor funding 14 low-income women's IVF cycles every year. It's about the paperwork. It's about the waiting. And it's about the quiet, brutal machinery of revenge that doesn't require a single raised voice. My name is Elaine, and for 22 years, I was married to a quiet architect named Robert who spent his weekends building elaborate puzzle boxes in the garage. I don't mean those flimsy decorative things you see at craft fairs. Robert sourced burled maple and walnut, cured his own stock for months in a humidity-controlled cabinet, and milled dovetail joints so tight they held water. His puzzle boxes had false bottoms, magnetic catches, sliding panels that only released if you tilted the box at exactly 17 degrees while pressing 2 non-adjacent corners simultaneously. He sold a handful to collectors and gave the rest to me as birthday presents, each one containing a different secret. A pair of sapphire earrings, a handwritten letter, once a tiny brass key to a safe deposit box I didn't yet know existed. He designed hospitals that could withstand seismic shifts of 8.2 on the Richter scale, but his real genius was in understanding how pressure points work, where to apply force so that the whole structure collapses or holds. That knowledge, it turned out, he had applied to our family as well. I, on the other hand, was a locksmith. Before I met Robert, I had a storefront on a tired strip mall in Tulsa between a check cashing place and a donut shop, whose grease hood vented directly into my doorframe. The sign read Elaine's Key and Lock in a font I painted myself with a stencil and some marine enamel that outlasted every business around me. I rekeyed deadbolts for anxious new homeowners, unlocked sedans for crying teenagers who'd left their keys on the dashboard, and drilled out ignition cylinders on trucks whose owners had lost their only set in a bar fight. I could pick a standard 5-pin tumbler in under 90 seconds with a tension wrench and a half-diamond pick. And on a good day, with the right lighting and a fresh cup of coffee, I could feel the individual pins clicking into the shear line with my eyes closed. I also kept the books for my shop with a level of obsession that rivaled Robert's blueprints. Every receipt filed by date and category, every tax deduction flagged with a colored tab, every invoice numbered sequentially and cross-referenced to a paper logbook. That skill set, mechanical precision plus financial fastidiousness, would later save my life. But on the day Robert's heart stopped in the Hy-Vee parking lot while he was loading a bag of potting soil into the trunk, all I knew was that the center of my universe had simply vanished. The store manager found his body slumped against the rear bumper, a loyalty rewards card still clutched in his left hand. He had 412 points. I remember that detail because it was so aggressively ordinary, so bureaucratic, that it split my grief into 1,000 tiny fragments I couldn't assemble into anything coherent. The funeral was a blur of casseroles, insincere handshakes, and floral arrangements that smelled like a perfumed assault. The visitation ran from 4 to 7 on a Thursday at a funeral home with carpet so beige it absorbed personality. I stood in a receiving line for 2 hours while distant cousins and former colleagues offered variations of "he's in a better place," and at least he didn't suffer. Phrases that felt like pebbles dropped into a well, each one making a hollow sound. But my stepdaughter Madison did not attend the visitation. She arrived the morning after the burial, pulling up to the house in a pearl-white Lexus SUV that still had the temporary registration tag in the rear window, her husband Derek at the wheel, both of them looking like they had just stepped out of a regional business magazine photo shoot. Madison is Robert's daughter from his first marriage. a woman in her early 40s who parlayed a bachelor's in healthcare administration into a series of increasingly lofty titles, currently serving as a regional operations director for a network of for-profit surgical centers. She wears blazers in shades of charcoal and navy that are cut too sharply for comfort, and she speaks in acronyms that I suspect she rehearses in the mirror to ensure the proper cadence of authority. Derek is her second husband, a man who describes himself as a wealth strategist, but whose LinkedIn profile lists a 17-month stint at a payday loan chain and a 3-year gap he calls independent consulting that I later learned was a bankruptcy proceeding in another state. Together they moved through my living room like an audit team, assigning value to furniture and emotion to photographs in a way that made my skin crawl. Madison announced, not asked, that I was in shock and needed rest while they handled everything. What handling everything meant in practice was that she and Derek swept through the house with 3 empty suitcases and a roll of black contractor bags, sorting Robert's possessions into categories: trash, donation, and keep. The keep pile being almost exclusively items with resale value. I watched from the hallway as Madison cleared a shelf of his study, a room he had treated as a sanctuary lined with rolled blueprints and engineering manuals. She picked up a chipped ceramic mug that said "World's Okayest Architect," glanced at the chip, and dropped it into a trash bag without hesitation. She swept a collection of drafting pencils into another bag, the leads snapping audibly. And then she reached for a slim cloth-bound volume of Emily Dickinson's poems that Robert had kept on his desk since his undergraduate days, a book I had seen him read aloud from on quiet Sunday mornings, his voice a low rumble that filled the kitchen while I made pancakes. Madison held it at arm's length, wrinkled her nose, and said to Derek, "Nobody reads this stuff anymore. It's just clutter." She tossed it toward a Goodwill box with a definitive, dismissive arc. The book landed with a sound that was wrong, a heavy, dense thump rather than the light flutter of paper. I registered that sound deep in my gut, but I didn't react. I had learned decades ago that arguing with Madison only sharpened her teeth. The one time I had asked her, politely, to wait before selling her father's vintage drafting table, she had accused me of hoarding grief and threatened to involve a mediator. So I stood there, a silent, grieving widow in her peripheral vision, and let the moment pass. Later that evening, after Madison and Derek had retreated to a hotel because the house had too much dust, I retrieved the book from the cardboard box. The cover was a faded indigo with gold lettering, the spine cracked from decades of opening. I lifted it, and the weight was immediately suspicious, too dense for a volume that size. I opened the front cover, and instead of the first poem, I saw that the pages had been carefully glued together along their outer edges, then hollowed out in the center to form a rectangular cavity about 4 inches by 6. Inside that cavity sat 2 objects: a small brass safe deposit key with the number 143 stamped on the bow, and a folded sheet of paper, the kind of onion skin stationery Robert used for his personal correspondence, creamy white with a faint watermark of a compass rose. I unfolded the note with trembling, careful fingers, and there, in Robert's distinctive architectural script, neat block letters with small serifs, was a message that rearranged the molecular structure of my grief. The note read, "Elaine, if you're reading this, I'm gone and they're already circling. Do not trust Madison and Derek. They've been siphoning money from my firm's operating account for 18 months using forged invoices from shell companies they control. I didn't confront them because I was building a trap, a financial structure they can't see and can't break, but it needed time to mature. The safe deposit box at First Midwest on Elston Avenue contains the full forensic accounting, the original forged documents, and a surprise. The access requires your signature and your thumbprint. Together, it cannot be opened without you alive, present, and acting under your own volition. Whatever they ask for, delay, play foggy. Call Leonhardt and Cross, the number taped to the back of the key. Destroy this note. I love you. Save yourself. I read it 3 times while sitting on the edge of the bed where Robert used to leave his reading glasses on the nightstand, arranged at a precise 45-degree angle to the lamp. The anger came later. What I felt in that first moment was a kind of cold clarity, a crystalline understanding that the next few weeks would not be about grief, but about survival. I turned the key over, and there, taped to the brass with a strip of yellowing Scotch tape, was a business card that read, "Leonhardt and Cross, Estate and Trust Law, ESD. 1972, with a phone number in Indiana. I committed that number to memory, burned the note in the kitchen sink with a match from Robert's emergency camping kit, and tucked the key and the hollow book into a Ziploc bag inside a box of tampons at the bottom of my underwear drawer, because no one searches a 60-year-old widow's tampon box. That night I lay awake until 4 a.m, listening to the house settle, and I started to plan. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a contract isn't just paper, it's a promise, and that promises have teeth. Let's get back to it. The manipulation started early the next morning with a staged family meeting at Madison's kitchen island, a slab of polished black granite so reflective I could see my own distorted face staring back at me. I drove to their McMansion in a subdivision named something like the Estates at Whispering Oaks, where every house was a variation of the same beige stucco box with a 3-car garage and a decorative fountain that gurgled unconvincingly. Madison had summoned me with a text that read, "Need to discuss the estate logistics. 10 a.m. Coffee will be here." When I arrived, Derek was standing at a built-in espresso machine, pulling a shot with the studied concentration of a man who had watched a YouTube tutorial that morning. The kitchen smelled of over-roasted beans and air freshener. Madison had a stack of documents arranged on a leather portfolio, and she greeted me with a hug that felt like a transaction. "Elaine, honey," she began, her voice calibrated to a frequency of concern and efficiency. "We've been talking, and we think the smartest move right now is for you to take a step back from all this financial chaos. You're grieving. The last thing you need is a pile of paperwork and a house with a leaky roof." I noted that the roof did not leak. I had it replaced 4 years ago with high architectural-grade asphalt shingles that came with a 30-year warranty. But I nodded, letting my eyes unfocus slightly. She slid a durable power of attorney across the granite, along with a quitclaim deed that would transfer the house into a revocable living trust with her listed as trustee. The document was 17 pages long, single-spaced, printed on heavy bond paper with a notary stamp already in place, just waiting for a signature. She used the word protect 11 times in the next 10 minutes, temporary 14 times, and of course, whenever she needed to fill air. Derek chipped in with phrases like strategic liquidation and tax optimization, nodding along like a dashboard bobblehead. I could see the seams now. Robert's note had rewired my perception so that every gesture looked like a trap and every smile looked like a mask. But yelling or accusing them would achieve nothing except alerting them that I knew. So I did exactly what Robert had asked. I played foggy. I took a sip of the oversweetened latte Derek handed me and said, "You know, Madison, I think you're probably right. My memory's been a little slippery since the funeral. I can't keep track of days. Maybe we could talk about all this after my next doctor's appointment. They want to check my cognitive function, something about stress-induced lapses." I saw the flicker in her eyes, a micro-expression that lasted less than half a second but communicated raw satisfaction. Fragile was exactly what she wanted. A fragile widow is a compliant widow. She agreed to postpone, patting my hand with a series of quick, dry taps that felt like a clerk stamping a receipt. Over the next 2 weeks, they escalated the pressure while maintaining the veneer of concern. Madison called daily, always at 11 in the morning, to ask how I was feeling and to remind me that the paperwork timeline is getting tight with the probate deadlines. She sent Derek over to help with household chores that he performed incompetently, which required me to redo them anyway. And during each visit, he casually mentioned that the house was too big for one person, that the neighborhood was declining, that they knew a great assisted living facility in Scottsdale. The message was clear: sign over everything and let us manage your life. I allowed myself to appear to buckle under the pressure. I started wearing the same cardigan for days in a row. I let a few dishes pile up in the sink. I mentioned, in a quavering voice, that I sometimes forgot where I'd parked the car. When Madison suggested I move into their guest room, for my safety, just for a few weeks until you're feeling steadier, I said yes with a sigh that I hoped sounded resigned. In truth, moving into their house was part of a calculus I was already running. I needed access to their daily routines, their paperwork, and their unguarded conversations, and I could not get that from a distance. I moved in on a rainy Tuesday, bringing only a single suitcase, my purse, and the tampon box with the book and key. The guest room was on the ground floor at the end of a long hallway, decorated in a palette of beige and blush that felt designed to induce passivity. The floral duvet was starchy and smelled of lavender detergent. The windows were double-paned and didn't open fully, fitted with locks designed to prevent children from falling out, but that also prevented easy escape. And most tellingly, the door had a deadbolt installed on the outside of the frame, not the inside. I noticed it within 30 seconds of entering the room. It was a standard quickset deadbolt, keyed from the hallway side only, and I recognized the model because I had installed dozens of them in rental properties for landlords who wanted to control tenants. It was not a safety feature. It was a cage. I said nothing. I unpacked my clothes into the dresser, tucked the tampon box inside a folded pair of wool socks, and began my undercover investigation. Living under their roof became an exercise in quiet observation. I established a daily routine that appeared aimless, but was in fact a systematic intelligence-gathering operation. I woke at 5:30, before anyone else, and spent an hour walking the perimeter of each room on the main floor, noting the locations of filing cabinets, locks, and documents left carelessly on counters. Derek left for whatever passed as his office at 7:15, driving a leased BMW sedan that made a distinctive high-pitched whine on cold starts. Madison's schedule was less predictable. She worked from a home office with a frosted glass door, but she frequently left for meetings at the hospital network's corporate headquarters, returning hours later with a tense set to her jaw that I cataloged. I began keeping a mental log, and later a small paper notebook hidden in the air vent of my room, of their daily rhythms, the times of phone calls, the duration of arguments, the cadence of financial stress. The first major red flag surfaced during the second week of my stay. Every Thursday afternoon around 2 o'clock, Madison's cell phone buzzed with a specific ringtone, a jaunty electronic melody that sounded designed to mask its urgency. She would glance at the screen, her face tightening, then step into the backyard, pacing the length of the covered patio in a circuit that took exactly 2 minutes and 40 seconds per lap. I measured it by counting the seconds between each appearance at the sliding glass door. Her voice was never raised, but the clipped consonants and the repetitive phrase, "That deadline is not flexible," carried through the glass. After each call, she retreated to her home office, locked the door, and didn't emerge for an hour. On one such Thursday, Derek was home with a stomach complaint, and I overheard him mutter to himself in the kitchen, "If that audit timeline slips again, we're dead." I filed the phrase "audit timeline" alongside "deadline is not flexible" and started connecting dots. The physical evidence came through a household accident, one I may have subtly engineered. The guest bathroom had a small vanity with a single-handle faucet that I noticed dripped persistently when the water was turned off. I had been living there for nearly 3 weeks when I decided to use that drip as an entry point. One morning, while Madison was at a golf club fundraiser and Derek was, according to him, attending a continuing education seminar, I turned the angle stop valve under the sink and deliberately cracked the old galvanized supply line by applying lateral pressure with the heel of my hand while the water was under full pressure. The effect was immediate and dramatic. A spray of cold water erupted with a sound like a tornado siren, soaking the vanity, arcing across the tile, and pooling rapidly into the hallway. My timing was precise. I knew the burst would draw both of them, and I had positioned myself to appear startled but not panicked. Madison shrieked from somewhere upstairs, a sharp, nasal sound that cut through the water's roar. Derek came barreling down the hall in his socks, slipping on the wet tile and nearly going down. Both of them stared at the geyser as though it were a software update they couldn't resolve with a restart. "Do something," Madison yelled at Derek. Derek flapped his hands like a startled bird and said, "I'll call a plumber. This is going to cost a fortune." Neither of them knew where the main water shutoff was. Neither of them had ever turned an angle stop valve. They stood there, two highly compensated fraud artists, utterly helpless in the face of basic domestic plumbing. I, however, had spent 20 years under sink cabinets with a pipe wrench, a tube of plumber's putty, and a quiet determination never to pay a service call for something I could fix myself. I pushed past them, dripping and focused, shut off the angle stop with a quarter turn, and assessed the break. Within 40 minutes, using a shark bite push-to-connect coupling I found in Derek's woefully sparse toolbox, a hacksaw, and a scrap of sandpaper, I had the pipe section replaced and the water restored. Shark bite fittings are a modern miracle for quick repairs. You just cut the pipe clean, deburr the edge, and push the fitting on until it clicks. No soldering, no waiting. The click is deeply satisfying, a mechanical confirmation of competence. As I worked, kneeling on the wet floor with water dripping from my hair, I heard Derek hiss to Madison in the hallway, "This house is a money pit. If that trust doesn't clear by the end of the quarter, we're going to have serious liquidity problems." Madison's response was sharp and low. "Shut up. Just shut up. The audit timeline is what matters right now, and I can't have you panicking in front of her." I tightened the last fitting, wiped my hands on a rag, and smiled at them both. All fixed. Just needed a little elbow grease. The look that passed between them was not gratitude. It was annoyance that I had demonstrated competence they couldn't afford for me to have. I understood in that moment that my practical skills were not just useful. They were a threat to their narrative of my helplessness. Over the next few days, I would use that dynamic to my advantage. 3 days later, with the plumbing crisis serving as a fresh reminder of their own uselessness, they both left for an all-day golf charity event in a neighboring county. Madison wore a pastel polo and white golf skirt that looked like a costume. Derek wore a visor. They clattered out of the garage at 9:15 a.m. with a cooler full of sparkling water, and I watched from the guest room window until the Lexus's taillights disappeared around the corner. I gave them 30 minutes to be sure, then retrieved my locksmith toolkit from the wool socks, where I had hidden it inside a rolled-up compression bag of clothes. The toolkit was a vintage leather roll, slightly cracked at the seams, containing a set of tension wrenches in 3 widths, a half-diamond pick, a hook pick, a Bogota rake, and a small steel shim for bypassing simple latches. I had added a miniature LED flashlight and a pair of nitrile gloves. I was 59 years old, and my hands had a slight tremor in the mornings, but the muscle memory was still there, encoded in my tendons and fingertips. Madison's home office door had a standard quickset knob lock, the same model used in hundreds of houses across the Midwest, a simple pin-tumbler mechanism with 5 pins. I knelt in the hallway, inserted a tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applied very light rotational pressure clockwise, just enough to bind the pins, and then inserted the Bogota rake. I worked the rake in and out rapidly, a technique known colloquially as raking, which relies on the random bouncing of the driver pins until they all temporarily catch at the shear line. The first few strokes didn't set. I adjusted my tension slightly lighter, feeling for the subtle click of each pin reaching the shear line. The 4th try, I felt a series of rapid, sequential clicks, and the plug rotated fully. The door swung open in 47 seconds. It's not a record, but at my age, it was respectable. Inside, the office was organized with a sterile precision that felt aggressive. A large L-shaped desk held dual monitors, a mechanical keyboard, and a stack of manila folders. The filing cabinet in the corner was a 2-drawer beige steel unit, locked with a cheap combination padlock that secured a metal hasp. I bypassed the combination by tipping the cabinet onto its back, a trick that requires a surprising amount of core strength, and using a thin steel shim to slide between the hasp and the locking bolt. The shim, a piece of flexible spring steel I had cut from an automotive feeler gauge years ago, slid in with a satisfying rasp, and the bolt popped free. I opened the top drawer and found what can only be described as a poorly curated museum of financial desperation. The files inside were a mix of loan documents, credit card statements with balances that exceeded most mortgages, and a collection of documents related to shell companies. The smoking gun was a home equity line of credit agreement for $210,000, secured against my home, the house Robert and I had lived in for 2 decades, the one with the roof I'd re-roofed and the kitchen I'd red-aisled. My signature appeared at the bottom, a looping cursive, Elaine M. Carter that looked at a glance like mine. But I pulled out a known authentic copy of my signature from a checkbook I kept in my purse and compared them. The forged signature had 3 telltale deviations. The loop of the initial E was pulled too far to the right, extending past the vertical line at a 14-degree angle instead of the 10 degrees I naturally use. The cross of the T in Carter was a millimeter too high and angled upward instead of horizontal. And the downward stroke of the G in Elaine terminated in a curling flourish I never use, a flourish that a trained forensic document examiner would flag as an embellished termination. a common feature of forgery where the forger unconsciously adds decorative elements. I rested my finger on that flourish and felt a cold, precise fury settle into my chest. Behind that file, I found a manila envelope containing shredded documents that had been hastily reassembled with Scotch tape, as if someone had started the destruction process and then changed their mind. I carefully removed the strips and laid them out on the carpet. The reconstruction took nearly 2 hours of kneeling on the floor, matching torn edges under the glow of my LED flashlight. The first completed page was a fabricated invoice from a company called Med Supply Dynamics, LLC, billing Robert's architectural firm for $37,200 in procurement consulting fees for a hospital project in Ohio. I knew that project well. Robert and I had driven out to the site together in 2018, and he had pointed out the foundation pour. He never used a procurement consultant. He sourced all materials directly through his firm's purchasing department, a small office run by a meticulous woman named Fran who had worked there for 30 years and would have flagged any invoice she didn't recognize. The second page was a spreadsheet titled Project Horizon, which detailed a series of wire transfers to a bank in the Cayman Islands, with a projected aggregate balance of $400,000 by the end of the next fiscal quarter. The third was a draft email, printed out, from Madison to a bankruptcy attorney in Arizona, asking about the timeline for transferring joint liability for a 6-figure HELOC to a co-signer under a durable power of attorney. The co-signer, according to the email's recipient line, was me. They were planning to saddle me with the entire debt load of their collapsing scheme and then vanish to a jurisdiction without a U.S. extradition treaty, leaving me to face the creditors and the foreclosure notices while they sipped drinks on a beach. I photographed everything using a burner phone I had bought at a gas station 3 days earlier, a prepaid flip phone with a grainy camera that I paid for in cash, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses even though I knew it was paranoid. I took 57 photographs, methodically, making sure each document was fully captured with its edges visible for chain of custody purposes. Then I reassembled the shredded strips the best I could, replaced everything in the filing cabinet, locked the padlock, tipped the cabinet back upright, relocked the office door behind me, and retreated to my guest room to review the photos. That evening at dinner, a meal of overcooked salmon and quinoa that Madison had ordered from a meal prep service, I asked her how work was going. She smiled, a wide smile that didn't reach her cheekbones, and said she had just been nominated for a regional leadership award for excellence in operational integrity. I complimented her on the achievement and took another bite of salmon. The ally entered the narrative the next morning, on a park bench 3 blocks from the nearest bus stop, which I had ridden on a circuitous route that involved 2 transfers and a 10-minute walk through a strip mall parking lot to ensure I wasn't followed. I called the number from the back of the key using the burner phone, and a gravelly voice answered on the second ring. Leonhardt. I gave my name and Robert's, and there was a long pause, then an address for a diner called the Cozy Corner that had been serving liver and onions since 1963. I arrived an hour later and found Harold Leonhardt in a corner booth, a man of 82 with a full head of white hair, a cane with a brass duck's head handle, and a presence that immediately filled the space. The diner smelled of old coffee and griddle grease, and the waitress knew his order by heart: black coffee and a slice of pie, no ice cream. Harold unfolded a leather folio from his briefcase and spread out documents across the Formica table. He confirmed that Robert had come to him 16 months earlier, pale and shaking, carrying a folder of evidence he had assembled in secret. Robert had noticed accounting anomalies in his firm's quarterly reports, small, incremental discrepancies in the consulting line items, all funneled through shell companies that traced back to Madison and Derek. Rather than confront them and trigger a fight they would lose, he and Harold constructed an entire defensive architecture. Robert restructured his estate into a blind, irrevocable trust, naming me as the sole lifetime beneficiary with complete access under the condition of voluntary, informed, and present consent. The trust held the house, which had been appraised at $460,000, 2 investment accounts totaling just under $1 million, and a secondary life insurance policy worth $300,000 that Madison was not aware existed. A policy he had purchased quietly through a separate carrier 5 years earlier and routed through the trust's holding entity. The trust contained a dead man's switch clause that Harold explained in granular detail. If I ever attempted to sign over my rights under duress, defined by a third-party psychological evaluation protocol, or if I failed to present myself physically at the designated bank trust office once every calendar year and provide biometric verification including a thumbprint scan, all assets would immediately and irrevocably convert to a charitable remainder trust benefiting an organization called the Ethics Watchdog Coalition, a nonprofit that investigates corporate fraud. Madison could not access a single cent without my willing, unimpaired participation. And the moment a court, a notary, or a bank officer flagged any irregularity, the trap snapped irrevocably. Harold then lowered his voice further and told me something that rearranged my understanding of the timeline. His son, David Leonhardt, was a senior compliance officer at the U.S. Attorney's Office, specifically assigned to healthcare fraud. The hospital network where Madison worked had been under federal investigation for 18 months for Medicare upcoding fraud, a scheme where they systematically billed for complex surgical procedures, cardiac ablations, endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatographies, and the like that were never performed, while the actual procedures were far simpler and less reimbursable. The estimated fraudulent billing totaled $6 million. Madison was not the mastermind. She was a mid-level executive with signature authority on a set of billing codes that formed a critical junction in the fraud's paper trail. The FBI needed one key piece of evidence: her login credentials to the off-site billing portal that reconciled procedure codes with insurance submissions, a portal that auto-deleted records after 60 days and required two-factor authentication tied to her office desktop. Harold asked if I would be willing, as a civilian, to install a hardware keylogger on her desktop machine. He described it as assisting a federal investigation and assured me that my cooperation would be documented and protected. I didn't hesitate. I told him I could do it, and I described the layout of her office, the computer's USB port configuration, and the exact model of keyboard. Harold smiled, a small, dry smile, and called me a professional. He slid a small padded envelope across the table containing a keylogger device, a tiny USB dongle about the size of a thumbnail, that recorded every keystroke to an internal flash memory chip without any software installation or network footprint. I tucked the envelope into my coat pocket, and we shook hands. His grip was dry and firm. That weekend, while Madison and Derek attended a charity gala in downtown Chicago, I re-entered the office using the same lockpicking method, this time in under a minute, my confidence returning. The desktop tower sat on the floor, a black Dell with a bank of USB ports in the front and rear. I unplugged the keyboard's USB connector, plugged the keylogger into the port, and then plugged the keyboard into the keylogger's pass-through female end. The device was completely flush, no blinking lights, indistinguishable from a normal USB plug unless someone physically tugged on the cable and noticed the extra hardware. I left it there and relocked the office. The device captured data for 10 days before I retrieved it during another carefully timed window, and the contents were explosive. Every password to the billing portal, a draft email to a co-conspirator named Reggie that read, "Elaine's signature is the last piece we need before the transfer. Once the trust clears, we're on a plane." And most damaging, a series of keystroke sequences showing that Madison was altering procedure codes after they had been submitted, a direct violation of federal health care fraud statutes. I delivered the keylogger, wrapped in a Ricola cough drop tin, to Harold in another diner handoff, this time with David present, a solemn man in a blue suit who thanked me with a depth of sincerity that I hadn't expected. The maximum cruelty beat arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the keylogger retrieval. The stress of living in constant subterfuge had been taking a physical toll. I had intermittent chest tightness, probably reflux or anxiety, but it was real enough that I had seen a cardiologist and was wearing a Holter monitor for a week. I had not yet informed Madison and Derek of the cardiac testing, but I knew that a genuine scare could serve as a litmus test. That day, while I was alone with Madison in the kitchen, I decided to stage a collapse. I had rehearsed it mentally a dozen times. I would be reaching for a glass in the cabinet, let my body go slack, and fall in a way that looked like a syncopal episode, a sudden loss of consciousness. I clutched the counter, let out a garbled gasp, and went down, my head narrowly missing the granite edge, my legs crumpling under me with a messy thump of magnets scattering from the fridge. I lay motionless on the cold tile, face down, one arm twisted under my body, and I held my breath. Madison was sitting at the kitchen island scrolling on her phone when I fell. I heard the scrape of her stool, and then, instead of footsteps toward me, I heard footsteps away. She stepped over my legs, deliberate and unhurried. I could feel the slight displacement of air as she passed. She did not check my pulse. She did not call my name. She walked to the counter, picked up a manila folder that had been lying by the espresso machine, a folder I recognized as the probate document she had been pressuring me to sign, and held it to her chest like a shield. Then she walked out of the kitchen entirely, her heels clicking on the hardwood, and I heard the click of her office door locking. I lay on that floor for 3 full minutes, counting my own pulse in my ears, and I waited for her to call 911. She did not call. When I finally raised myself up, my eyes wet with tears that were only partly theatrical, I understood that whatever residual hope I had harbored about family reconciliation had been permanently incinerated. That night, I sat in my locked guest room, the deadbolt inaccessible to me from the inside, and I called Harold to upgrade the plan from evidence gathering to active execution. The confrontation came 5 days later, on a Friday morning that dawned gray and humid. The FBI had accelerated their indictment timeline after receiving the keylogger data, which had confirmed a pattern of Medicare fraud extending to 5 other regional executives. They planned to execute arrest warrants simultaneously at multiple locations, and our household was on the list. But Madison and Derek remained oblivious. They only knew that the trust's annual reinvestment deadline was 3 days away, and without my biometric signature at the First Midwest Trust office on Elston Avenue, the assets would lock permanently away from them. They bundled me into the back of their Lexus at 8 in the morning with a story about a routine estate planning meeting that required my physical presence. Derek's knuckles were white on the steering wheel the entire drive, and Madison, sitting in the passenger seat, kept touching a USB drive in her blazer pocket, a gesture I recognized as anxious verification. That USB drive, I later learned, contained a forged power of attorney with a duplicate notary stamp they had purchased on a darknet forum for $3,000 in Bitcoin, which they intended to swap for the original paperwork during a moment of confusion at the bank. I had prepared my own equipment. The previous week, I had purchased a small digital voice recorder from an electronics store, paid in cash, and spent an afternoon learning its activation mechanism, a simple slide switch that I could trigger through fabric. I sewed a thin, felt-lined pocket into the inner seam of my wool blazer, positioned at the left hip, and placed the recorder there, microphone facing outward. I recorded the entire car ride, Madison's clipped instructions to just let me do the talking, Derek's repeated insistence that it was all going to be fine once we're through this, and the palpable tension that hummed in the Lexus's leather interior like a live wire. At one point, Madison turned to me and said, "Elaine, you look lovely today. So important to show the trust officer you're in good spirits." I smiled and said nothing, feeling the faint vibration of the recorder's spinning disc against my hip. At the bank, they frog-marched me into a private conference room on the 2nd floor, a space with dark wood paneling, a long table polished to a glassy sheen, and a window that looked out onto a parking garage. A trust officer named Mr. Bat was already seated at the head of the table, an elegant man in his 50s with a calm, professional demeanor that immediately set me at ease in a way Madison's presence did not. Beside him sat a notary public with a crimson seal embosser, and in the corner stood a uniformed bank security guard, a young man with a serious expression and a name tag that read Pacheco. Madison produced a thick stack of documents from her leather folio and spread them across the table. The full trust distribution authorization, the quitclaim deed, the durable power of attorney, each with adhesive flags marking signature lines in fluorescent pink. She clicked open a pen, a heavy silver Montblanc, and placed it in my hand with the air of someone handing a shovel to a gravedigger. "Just sign where the flags are, Elaine," Madison said, her voice syrupy sweet but her thumbnail tapping the table's surface at a rate of about 3 taps per second, a metronome of stress. Derek positioned himself directly behind my chair, close enough that I could smell his spearmint vape and the chemical edge of his cologne. I could feel the heat of his presence, an intimidation tactic so transparent it was almost laughable. I picked up the pen, held it poised above the first line, and then very deliberately placed it down on top of the document, parallel to the edge of the paper. I looked at Mr. Bat, at the notary, and then at Madison, and I spoke a line I had rehearsed in the mirror of my guest prison room for 3 consecutive nights. I will not sign my life over to people who stepped over my dying body to grab a folder of stolen money. The silence that followed was so dense you could have measured it with a pressure gauge. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and a distant air conditioning compressor kicking on. Madison's face cycled through something that looked like a software crash. Confusion, then a rising flush of anger, then a hollowing out around the eyes as a very specific fear crystallized. Derek made a strangled noise and his weight shifted, perhaps toward the door, but the security guard, Pacheco, had already moved to block the only exit. The conference room door opened smoothly, without drama, and 4 federal agents walked in, 2 men and 2 women in plain clothes, their credentials pinned to their lapels, their presence filling the room with a gravity that made everything else feel flimsy. Behind them came Harold Leonhardt, leaning on his cane, and his son David, holding the arrest warrant. The lead agent, a woman with a low, calm voice, began reciting charges: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, aggravated identity theft, and multiple counts of healthcare fraud under Title 18, Section 1347. Derek made a desperate break for the door that ended with him tripping over a potted ficus and being brought to the ground by Pacheco in a move that the guard later described, with some satisfaction, as a basic compliance hold. The ficus wobbled, shed a few leaves, and settled. Madison just stood there, utterly frozen, as the agent recited her Miranda rights, and I remember thinking how small she looked without her blazer's shoulder pads, how human and breakable and ordinary. The aftermath unfolded over 14 months, a slow cascade of legal consequences that I followed from a front row seat in various federal courtrooms. Madison was convicted on 4 counts of healthcare fraud, 1 count of wire fraud, and 1 count of aggravated identity theft for the forged HELOC. She received a sentence of 7 years at the Federal Correctional Institution in Alderson, West Virginia, a place known colloquially as Camp Cupcake. But I assure you, no cupcake is involved in serving a federal sentence. Derek, in a gambit of pure self-preservation, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors and pleaded guilty to the financial fraud charges, avoiding the healthcare counts, but still drew a sentence of 4 years and 5 months in a medium security facility. The house, the McMansion with the beige stucco and the outdoor deadbolt, was seized under asset forfeiture and sold at auction, the proceeds applied to the Medicare restitution order. The forged HELOC was voided by the lender within 30 days of my sworn affidavit, and I was fully exonerated from any liability. The blind, irrevocable trust executed its dead man switch protocol flawlessly, converting temporarily to the charitable remainder trust for a statutory period of 60 days, while compliance auditors verified my lack of duress, and then reconstituting under my sole, unrestricted control. But the legal victory, while satisfying in a procedural sense, wasn't the part that brought me a quiet, settled peace. What came next was the revenge that actually made a difference, the kind that writes a recurring transaction into the ledger of the universe. I filed a separate civil lawsuit against Madison in state court for breach of contract concerning the $68,000 I had advanced from Robert's first life insurance payout, the one that predated the trust, to fund her fertility treatments. This was a story she had forgotten, or more likely, had never intended to honor in the first place. 2 years before Robert's death, Madison had come to me in tears, a rare moment of apparent vulnerability, telling me that she and Derek were struggling with unexplained infertility and that IVF was their only option. The clinic had quoted a total cost of $68,000 for 2 full cycles with genetic testing, medication, and cryopreservation, and their insurance, she claimed, covered none of it. She had no savings because I now understand her assets were all leveraged in fraudulent schemes. She asked for help. I didn't just hand over cash. I had a notarized contract drafted by a local attorney, specifying that the $68,000 was a repayable advance contingent on her providing me with a home and care in my old age, should I need it. She signed it without hesitation, probably assuming I would never enforce it, that my maternal softness would dissolve the obligation into a gift. She was wrong. Once the IVF succeeded, twin boys born healthy and screaming, she moved across the country to the Chicago suburbs for the hospital job, sent me a Christmas card the first year, and then ghosted me entirely. When Robert died, she saw an opportunity to monetize my grief and erase the debt in one stroke. I sued for breach of contract, and because I had kept every receipt, every clinic invoice, every canceled check, the case was airtight. The court awarded me $95,000. The principal of $68,000, plus prejudgment interest calculated at the statutory rate from the date of breach, plus emotional distress damages, plus full recovery of my attorney's fees. The judgment was entered, and after she failed to voluntarily pay, I sought and was granted a writ of garnishment against any future wages. Even after her release from prison, that garnishment will follow her, because federal inmates are not exempt from state civil judgments, and any legitimate employment she secures will trigger a withholding order. I receive exactly $800 a month, direct deposited into a dedicated P.O. box account, and the check stub, which I have framed the first one, bears the memo line I insisted on during the settlement negotiation. Family Betrayal Fee. That monthly $800 does not sit in my account earning interest. I used a portion of the restored trust assets to incorporate a nonprofit called Second Chance IVF, and the garnished funds directly subsidize fertility treatments for low-income women who face the same impossible cost barrier that Madison exploited. We operate out of a small storefront in the same strip mall where Elaine's key and lock once stood, the donut shop having been replaced by a dental insurance office. The support group meets twice a month, a circle of folding chairs under fluorescent lights, and we share stories and grant applications and the quiet, fierce hope of starting families against long odds. To date, 14 women have become mothers through our direct financial assistance, and every time I receive a birth announcement, I photocopy it and staple it to the check stub for that month, a private ritual of symmetry that Robert would have appreciated with his puzzle-maker's mind. I have learned that integrity is not a suggestion. It is the only currency that does not depreciate under inflation, fraud, or time. And if someone tries to cash a check on your goodwill without making a deposit, you do not simply close the account. You file the paperwork, you wait, you let the court system grind its slow, precise gears, and you garnish every last dime until the debt is paid in full, with interest, with memo lines that they will see for the rest of their working lives. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe that a promise is a binding contract, hit that like button and subscribe so the algorithm delivers more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.